Now, among the many remaining questions in this body of research is whether, how, and to what extent we can characterize such activities and organizations as this idea of productive citizenship, which I understand as active civic engagement by and through cognitive cultural producers, to borrow Alan Scott's term, and systems of production, and how municipal and business leaders can foster it for the public benefit. So some questions include, what kind of productive citizen is the craftsperson, the artist, and the artisanal worker? What kind of citizenship is being enacted and promoted by these occupational groups and businesses that regularly connect with their cities through logics of authenticity that privilege and promote the local and construct communities around consumption and production? And finally, how do they engage politically and civically, and what impacts do these actions have on urban space? So today I want to connect these questions to actions that I've observed in actual urban spaces. I'm a sociologist, I'm also an urban ethnographer, and I'm going to draw on two qualitative research projects I've conducted, one of which is ongoing at the moment, that examine a broad range of creative workers, mostly people who work with the material or in terms of cultural content, to show how these workers do citizenship as makers. Now, what's really interesting is in these cases is the disparate urban context of my projects. So they represent polar extremes. The first was based in New York City, obviously the largest city in the US, 8.5 million people. And the second is a place called Newburgh, a small city of only 30,000 people, located 60 miles north of New York City. So in this larger urban context, the elite city, as it's been called in many sources, the greater cultural economy has more or less subsumed craft and artisanal production, with workers and businesses becoming intertwined with existing processes of gentrification, displacement, and co-optation. The workers there are less active civically and politically at the local level. Their influence on the production of urban space in New York City is largely a part of greater forces of legitimized work and consumption of upscale forms of culture. In the smaller context, however, craft and other cultural and creative workers become highly engaged civically and politically, with more direct and potentially negative consequences for existing communities. They form what I call an entrepreneurial Bohemia, a creative community of production, consumption, and housing, in which these workers own their own homes and businesses, occupy a higher structural position with greater local power, and believe in the power and potential of the creative economy that they have constructed to develop this place called Newburgh and improve the lives of its many low-income residents. Despite immense optimism from these creative workers, their strategy of, as one calls it, urban revitalization through craft has significant limitations and has given a disproportionate amount of power to a group of people with limited experience to no experience or expertise in conditions of urban poverty to shape urban spaces in their own class-coded, culturally elite image under the guise of revitalization. So let me just give a little tour of what I'm going to be covering. I'll focus on the work from my first project on New York City based on a book I'll get to in a second. I'll then talk a little bit about Newburgh, which I'm sure most people are very unfamiliar with. Then I will just discuss the sort of literature on gentrifiers as political actors and apply that to the Newburgh context, and then some concluding thoughts. Now, I figured before I begin I should just point out that in looking at these US cases, obviously compared to Europe, European countries, European cities, the US provides very, very little, if any, funding, public funding, that is for arts, culture, craft, artisanal production at all. Most of the production for these activities in American cities comes from private sources. So when we talk about any kind of local forms of support for these activities or any kind of policy or initiatives, we're really talking about policies that are more general to urban change, like municipal rezonings to accommodate certain forms of production, like distilling or craft brewing, forms of marketing, tax incentives, large-scale development projects that could be negotiated to have some kind of cultural component. We see all these strategies in abundance in New York and other large cities, and we see far fewer of them in places of smaller scale, like Newburgh, which lack many of these resources that these large cities have and take for granted. So as I'm going to also show, it's these lack of resources, as well as what these workers think is a lack of any kind of coherent vision for Newburgh's future direction that leads them to become more active locally and civically and take it upon themselves to help in its growth. Okay. First, let me talk a bit about how I came to study some of these craft workers and these artisanal producers and businesses. My most recent book, Masters of Craft, Old Jobs in the New Urban Economy, was the title, examines how a group of low-status service, light manufacturing, and manual labor jobs have become transformed into cool, cultural taste-making occupations that people with other options in the labor market, relatively privileged people in the labor force, seek out as alternative careers. So my research for this book, I studied cocktail bartenders, people who use mixology, a very specialized way of making drinks, craft distillers, people who apply a sense of authenticity, localness, sustainability, et cetera, to making small batches of spirits, similar to the craft beer that Mark and Pauline just discussed. I looked at upscale men's barbers, people who use a very traditional form of barbering and contemporary barbering techniques to make very stylish haircuts for urban professional men. And finally, whole animal butchers and butcher shop workers who use artisanal butchery techniques and apply a certain meat philosophy behind what is ethical and sustainable meat to make very rare kind of meat and meat products for their customers. So these are all very highly specialized versions of very common occupational categories occupying very niche segments of their industries. So among my findings is the idea that these workers only pursue these particular versions of these jobs while not experiencing them as forms of downward social mobility for people of their social class standing and backgrounds due to the set of cultural repertoires, the sort of strategies of action that they allow them to enact. These include technical skills based on this sense of craft and craftsmanship and the ability to both understand and communicate rarefied sets of cultural knowledge. In other words, these workers want to work with their hands as well as their heads. They want to be creative. They want their work to be meaningful and fulfilling. And they want to both tell and teach the world about what it is that they are doing and making. So in this sense, they're all very well integrated into the so-called new economy in which knowledge, ideas, culture, and service are intertwined and also highly valued, while transforming these ordinary jobs into culturally elite, taste-making occupations. These jobs and the greater artisan economy have by now become rather legitimate occupational paths for some in the middle class and fairly enmeshed in the growth strategies and policies of developers and some city leaders. Now, in the book, I examine the moral economies of each of these occupations, how they organize themselves, the paths that people take to these jobs, the sense of craft and the logics of authenticity in their work, and the role of cultural performance as a form of exclusion in these occupational communities in terms of who actually can get these jobs. I'm going to return to this point a little later about how the nature of how to actually do these jobs is a basis for inequality in these emerging and expanding industries. And in short, as cultural performances, craft artisanal work, in addition to the actual craft skills and techniques that encompass the production process, requires the possession and circulation of cultural knowledge and the easy, natural seeming enactment of these behaviors. But of course, these cultural elements are all very much imprinted on the body and are very much strong signifiers of social class, not to mention race. So now in the context in which I conducted this research, obviously is New York City, the country's largest city. So when we ask how craft workers there are active citizens and how they do citizenship as makers, we have to consider this size and complexity. So while the city's cultural economy, within which craft and artisanal work are mere subsets, has had a tremendous impact on its growth and the shaping of urban space, workers mainly do so as part of a collective effort within their industry. At an individual level, they hold a strong occupational identity, but not so much a civic or political one at the local level that revolves around their role as craftspeople. Now, there are exceptions. Some obviously have a very strong political component to their work. The craft distillers and the whole animal butchers I studied in particular are supportive of and very active in creating systems of agricultural sustainability, for example, and pushing against more mainstream forms of mass production and distribution. For them, the craft work is a mere conduit to a greater purpose, similar to what Mark just talked about with the idea of craft brewers using it as more just a conduit to creating community, more as a means to an end to promote greater values. An example from my research is Joel, a craft distiller, who got into distilling from an interest in farming and small-scale agriculture. A brief quote: "Farmers are always going to be beholden to the market. The farmer is only going to make profit above what he would normally expect, and sometimes not even that, if the market at that point has its price point set higher than what he expected. But if he is selling directly to us at the same cost that we're buying it, he's cutting out the middleman. There's a lot of empathy for the idea of farmers, but the fact is that nobody does anything to help them because they're not buying directly from them. And I feel like the only action that can really be taken is on the localized level, like me buying from my local farmers. That's the only thing that's going to matter, close quote. So in these cases, workers already have these political interests in mind and have found craft to be a novel way to merely pursue them. Now, spatially, craft production and artisanal manufacturing have had quite a fascinating impact on New York City, even though it's in very small pockets of it. Transformed these derelict spaces, sometimes most of which are former industrial spaces, into spaces of cultural and material production. In doing so, craft and artisan work and consumption have helped reposition these neighborhoods and districts into global circuits of culture and capital. But they are also intertwined with processes of gentrification, displacement, and co-optation. Now, to understand this point, I think it's important to note that makers don't just make. They are not just workers and business owners. They also consume and live in some form of housing. These are not trivial concerns when we consider how tightly intertwined craft work is with lifestyle and aesthetic and ethical preferences. Literature, social science literature, urban studies literature usually looks at people as being very one-dimensional, isolating their occupational identity, treating production, consumption, and housing as separate spheres of inquiry, when in fact to understand them and to understand what productive citizenship really means, we need to look at them in concert with one another. Now, culture has been central to cities' economic growth and its policies and strategies since the late 20th century, including spatial configurations of cultural producers and their activities of work, consumption, and their housing preferences. These are all, they've been called modern versions of the classic Bohemia, or an artist community of countercultural lifestyles, self-actualized work, in which creative interests often trump monetary pursuits. Which have today become very much intertwined with urban economic growth and are often part of the creative city and new urbanism paradigms of development. Cultural production, again, of which craft and artisanal production are a subset, and especially within modern Bohemias, is tightly intertwined with these processes of gentrification, given artists and creative workers relatively low levels of economic capital and how the buzz, for lack of a better word, from their presence can attract wealthier residents and investors and escalate local property values. Their residency in these neighborhoods and the configuration of spaces that undergird their productive activities, including affordable housing, studios, cafes, performance spaces, other amenities, are all put at risk under the weight of more advanced forms of gentrification. Small-scale cultural producers, their spaces, their amenities are susceptible to being displaced in part as a consequence of their own actions. Requiring affordable conditions, today's Bohemias are precarious places in a perpetual state of being, as Richard Lloyd puts it, always already over. In large cities in which makers usually rent and taste communities form rather quickly, we see the ideas and products from creative workers spread quite easily to other spaces, often getting co-opted by larger businesses as part of this process. Obvious examples include big alcohol brands buying small labels or stealthily starting their own under a label of craft. But more pervasive, I'd say, is how these ideas have become mobile within and across cities, carried by these producers as consultants and social media influencers, by the traditional media, by entrepreneurs, and by consumers through their enhanced tastes and through forms of prosumption. Michael, a prominent cocktail bartender, owner, and consultant, explains it this way: going into like your regular bars, you can go in there and get an old-fashioned, a Manhattan, a martini, and it will be good. A good rye, a gin and tonic, and a fresh lime on the side, which is really, really nice. So it's things like that, I think, are from our kind of bars, cocktail bars, and it constantly comes down. It comes down, and it comes down, and I think a lot of people expect this. Customers are more educated. They expect to have fresh limes, fresh lemons in a cocktail list, close quote. This is a rather small example, but as Michael's really identifying here, I think this pattern plays out. The influential ideas largely come from the top of the cultural hierarchy, the elite cocktail bar, the respected craft brewery or distillery, the innovative whole animal butcher shop, numerous other examples, and trickles down to the regular spaces and becomes subsumed within them. For these producers, as Michael implies, this phenomenon is actually a success, which is theirs, their success. They have educated the consuming public so well that craft works as a business model. But if any space can become a craft space, and if makers don't actually own their spaces, they find themselves at increasing risk of being doubly displaced via both the real estate market amid advanced gentrification and co-optation by their larger industries. Now that's New York City. This is the extreme case, right? The larger case. But what does productive citizenship and production of urban space look like among makers in a small city context? There are by far more small cities than there are large ones. So since February 2017, I've been conducting this project on Newburgh. It's in the, this is New York. I don't have a map of the US. I'm assuming folks have an idea of where it is. It's in the northeast part of the country. Newburgh is right here. Again, 60 miles north of the city. This is the New York City down here, Newburgh's right there. So here's the Hudson River, this is the mid-Hudson River Valley, and here's a little kind of basic map of Newburgh. It's essentially 4 square miles, 2 by 2. It's a box, basically. So this is a fairly impoverished post-industrial city. Let me give a very brief, it's kind of I see it as like a microcosm of more or less every single industrial city of the US, just in concentrates. Everything that kind of happened to a major city in the US happened in Newburgh, just at a very small scale. Let me give you a brief history lesson of American cities of the 20th century. So Newburgh starts the 20th century as a major industrial city for its region at a much smaller scale. It had a lot of different types of industries. It was a place of first destination for immigrants, largely from Europe. And it was, at the time, very well known for being an architectural center, which it built upon in the early 20th century. It reached a peak population of 32,000 people in 1950. And in 1952, the National Civic League declared it an all-American city. That's a very important designation to have if you're a small city. Then we get these are the heyday photos, I like to call them, the golden ages. There's some of the architectural examples. The background there, this is the Hudson River and the Hudson Highlands. It's a local mountain chain. It's a very gorgeous, picturesque part of the state. Then we get our decline. So this happens post-war, like in most other major cities. We get the Great Migration, which in the United States means the migration of poor rural African Americans from the South, fleeing Jim Crow legislation, racism, and moving to northern cities for industrial jobs. And they happen to move up at the same exact time as industrial jobs flee and start going into the South and then start going to Mexico and then going overseas. Basic deindustrialization starts to occur. We also have suburbanization. We have white flight, in which many of these, the children of these European immigrants from the early 20th century leave to go to the suburbs. This leads to a budget shortfall in the 1960s. The city manager declares a racially inflected war on welfare, essentially blaming the poor African Americans moving there for their budgetary issues, cutting their welfare benefits, which were minuscule to begin with. We get a lot of new developments that start to take place. In the US, it was the building of the interstate highway system. You can kind of see it here. We get 2 highways, 84, which goes right there, and 87 is just on the left, that goes right there. Basically, right outside the city, choking commerce within, leading to the decline of whatever was left of its waterfront and its manufacturing. As a result, we get, let me go forward again, start to get mass abandonments, such as these examples here. Newburgh engages in what was known in the US as urban renewal, lasted from 1947 to 1972. Urban renewal was a federally funded program of demolition in which cities could apply for federal funding to demolish and destroy sections of their neighborhoods for the sake of renewing them, finding new uses and users for them as people were fleeing the city. Not pretty much, I don't know how many municipalities engage with this. A majority of municipalities engaged in this program. The problem is that the funding did not provide for growth. It did not provide for development. You had to do that on your own if you were a city. It only provided for demolition. So Newburgh destroyed about 20% of its city, just demolished it, destroyed it, including the entire waterfront, which is pretty much right here. This is all that's left. Due to political corruption, a lack of money, no insights, and various other reasons, they never developed it. So the city still owns about 20% of its properties, about 1,300 buildings that were demolished at the time, most of whom were occupied by poor African Americans. What do we have? Okay, so today, the city, in terms of demographics, it's about 50% Latin American, 30% African American, 20% white. It has very high crime rates. It has 20% abandonment. 1 out of every 5 buildings is empty. It has an uneducated workforce, nearly no employment opportunities, not exactly the kind of place you would expect to hear a conversation about craft and culture. However, it is where well-resourced, well-educated cultural workers and entrepreneurs from a broad array of creative industries have been recently moving, buying cheap properties, relocating, opening, or expanding their businesses after many decades of disinvestment in this city. Now, what explains this change? As Hira argues, we can only really understand urban change in the 21st century by considering how forces at multiple levels of analysis, namely he calls the global, the national, the municipal, and the community, simultaneously interact to influence local conditions and transformations. To understand change in small cities today, we must add another layer to this multiple level framework, which is the regional. Now, the emergence of the creative economy in Newburgh has depended on conditions in New York City. You may have heard that it's expensive. Its unaffordability has led many of the middle class to leave. The wealthy stay there because it's more or less for them within the middle. The poor can't leave. They have no resources to do so, and they need access to jobs that are going to be hiring unskilled, low-educated people. So they're on the sort of outskirts. New York's starting to resemble Paris in the sense that it's the dense core of the wealthy with the poor on the outside. So the newcomers I've been studying all cite being priced out in some capacity as a reason for why they leave New York City. Newburgh is just my case. This is happening in large cities across the US and other examples. So in this sense, I'm following the types of people I studied in that Masters of Craft book as they leave, not the same people, but types of people as they leave New York City for other more affordable urban environments. Now, Newburgh's greatest asset for newcomers are, well, its proximity to New York City, only 60 miles away, while still being an actual city, not a suburb, that they can afford, an important attribute for creative workers in need of spaces of both living and working. And of course, affordability is a very relative term. Now, most newcomers moving to Newburgh are in its more historic district. This is not surprising considering this part of the city has several place characteristics that these urbanites favor. It's walkable, it's dense, it has old and historic architecture. It's got that industrial kind of gritty texture to it. It more or less looks like what New York City looked like in 1999. So, you know, there's a cafe. This is all stuff you're going to recognize. This is Atlas Industries. This was a boutique furniture manufacturing from Brooklyn, couldn't afford it anymore. So they just move everything to Newburgh and expand their business. It's now their own industrial production. They have like 5 employees or something like that. 40 artist studios, performance spaces, gallery spaces, and all the rest of it. You know, most of them work in the cultural economy in some form. My sample includes photographers, videographers, artists, musicians, writers, artisans of various stripes like carpentry, bookbinding, letterpressing, skin products, craft beer. The craft distillery is coming. The craft cidery opened and is expanding. There's a coffee roaster. They make candles. There's potters. There's the guy who makes, what does he make? He makes pet supplies. Really fancy artisanal pet supplies like leashes and stuff. Designers of various types, furniture, graphic design, clothing, interior design, and all that stuff, right? So it's everything, really. You know, this guy's a woodworker. There's a potter. What else? I don't know what she does. Wood, obviously, something with wood. Blonde wood, it's everywhere now, right? So they've been opening up also amenities to support the social infrastructure, cafes, farm-to-table restaurants. Their actions in Newburgh of creating an economy that didn't exist before have repositioned the city from the periphery of the new global economy, even off the map, specifically its cultural sectors and circuits, to closer to its center as a small node in this larger regional picture. Most still depend on their clients, their networks and contacts from New York City, agents and galleries for representing artists and photographers, agencies and organizations for graphic designers and letterpress operators, affluent consumers for interior designers, bespoke bookmakers, clothing designers and wedding photographers, and aspiring residents for an expanding local real estate industry, and even restaurants who serve visitors from the larger city. Okay, so new creative workers in Newburgh are gentrifiers, as I mentioned. We can't look at them separately here, which raises the question, what do we know about gentrifiers as engaged citizens? Well, scholars have been arguing that gentrifiers are hardly passive consumers of urban space and culture, as they've often been depicted, and we now have much more nuanced picture of them. Research has identified 2 general factors behind their political engagement. First, gentrifiers tend to focus on neighborhood issues that have a direct impact on them. such as when parents become involved in schools and active in education policy when they have children. These actions can have negative effects on existing populations, such as the political displacement of existing low-income groups. Second, gentrifiers tend to become active in their neighborhoods to oppose further gentrification. Usually politically liberal, gentrifiers are often keenly aware of the potential impacts of their presence in a low-income neighborhood. Preservation in some form is often a motivating factor. My colleague, Japonica-Brown-Saracino, has a concept of the social preservationist, for example. And other studies document how some gentrifiers protest more advanced levels and forms of gentrification to preserve their own sense of place as even wealthier newcomers come to challenge it. Now, small city gentrifiers to places like Newburgh, however, offer new explanations for gentrifiers' attitudes and political engagement toward gentrification and development beyond narrow self-interest and forms of preservation, especially when they are creative. People who engage in the forms of cultural and material production that we're talking about here. Small cities offer creative workers who as a group tend to lack substantial economic and investment capital, greater opportunities to own property as opposed to just renting. There, they can effectively become not just home and business owners, but also small-scale developers and placemakers who significantly influence their small cities' socio-spatial environment. Their political activity in small cities then often comes from a position of not just being pro-development and gentrification for the sake of their own real estate investments, although it does that, but also from one of wanting to play a role in their future trajectories. So, how do they engage civically and politically? What are the factors that influence their attitudes and forms of engagements? I've identified two key ways in which they're productive citizens in their new city. So first, these makers engage in a relatively conventional civic and political activities as individual residents, like staying informed of local politics, attending and participating in government meetings, and joining task forces and committees. Like the craft workers who I studied in New York City, these folks did not already have an identity or an interest in local politics, but acquired them upon moving to Newburgh. So this context is important here. Japonica-Brown-Saracino argues that a place's social ecology plays a key role in shaping how people express their identities. She particularly focuses on their sexual identities. But upon arriving in the city, many of Newburgh's makers claim they have become far more politically aware and active at the local level than they were when they lived in the big city because Newburgh made sense to them. As one put it, I don't know much about city government and how it works, but I've been learning more and more with every meeting I go to. I didn't get involved in politics or government in Brooklyn because it's too big, but I'm slowly figuring out how it works here. So there's become, close quote, so there's become this kind of acquisition of an identity that is kind of leading them to want to get more active and involved. So in addition to this context, makers also draw on their identities as creative workers and how they explain their interests. They frame Newburgh as a place that is ripe for development and themselves as the actors capable of developing it. They all describe the city as a place of opportunity, sometimes using similar words like a place of potential, possibility, or promise, which they use in reference to the city itself. In short, it's the city that has the opportunity and potential to grow and improve. As they see it, the main source of this opportunity is the legacies from its past, namely its architecture that is historic, available, and again, affordable, and the city's distinct urban characteristics and amenities. But their experiences in other places and their structural position as creative class property owners shape this conceptualization and their self-understanding as ideal developers with viable ideas. As one put it, the potential of this place is so amazing. I think that that's what people in the art world are often able to see that other people can't get past, like realities on the ground. So that's why, in my opinion, we find these opportunities that other people would think is not an opportunity. There are parts where when there's nothing happening, you can kind of imagine, oh, I would do this here, I would do that here. I remember walking around Williamsburg and Bushwick, these are neighborhoods in Brooklyn, in the late 90s, and there were some similar aspects to Newburgh. Here you see a closed storefront, and you just go, oh, what would I do? And you just start imagining it, close quote. So as we see here, these newcomers often base their framing of its potential on their experiences in similar disinvested areas in large cities. And this experience and creative vision, combined with Newburgh's affordable and plentiful resources and its sensible scale, give them the ability to see the city as a perfect place to develop and for them to watch their ideas unfold. Their political and civic engagement then serves to enact a particular vision of place that revolves around middle-class coded tastes and the logics of cool cultural production. So with this new expression of their political identity and their interest in playing a role in the city's development, Newburgh's creative gentrifiers very much critically frame the existing political environment, chiefly the policies and the development projects being proposed and the leaders who are enacting them. These often include projects that revolve around urban poverty, affordable housing, social services that target the city's low-income population. Newcomers to Newburgh very much describe these as much of the same, their leaders as ineffective and incompetent, and believe that their aim is to keep the city poor to maintain their power, and that they simply lack the ability to see and have a vision for what it really needs. As one puts it, I'm quite worried about the development projects that are about to happen in reference to affordable housing. I'm struggling with trying to help educate people on what even good design is. People can't even discern really how something is going to be good and how something is going to be bad or what's the potential. They don't know that there can be green roofs that are open to the public on all of these buildings, or that there can be a parking lot that's designed to have a park on top of it, close quote. And here's the issue. So like how gentrification in general as a subtype of urban revitalization is often uneven, benefiting some groups and areas of cities more so than others, these newcomers' creative ideas for Newburgh are also highly uneven, focusing on certain spaces, buildings within the historic district, certain groups, middle-class newcomers and other creatives, and culturally coded ideas like craft and artisanal products, green architecture, art spaces, etc., more so than others like low-income populations, anti-poverty initiatives, and affordable housing. Their framing of the city's opportunity is based on their experiences that interpret its industrial era infrastructure and historic housing as plentiful, available, and affordable, but not as the consequence of decades of disinvestment and impoverishment. Now, the second way we see these workers in Newburgh become active citizens is as entrepreneurs, specifically in the sense that they consider the local creative economy that they have constructed to not just help develop a struggling city, but to benefit its existing low-income communities. I refer to what we see in Newburgh as an entrepreneurial Bohemia, distinct from existing conceptualizations of modern Bohemias in that its producers are owners instead of renters, which grants them far greater stability from displacement, from co-optation, and a more privileged position in the local social structure. So these creative folks, beyond not having an anti-bourgeois sensibility or ambivalent relationship with the market, like people in other modern Bohemias, Newburgh's cultural producers very much embrace the power and potential of the market and of the local creative economy to bring about positive change, very much a very much supply-side economic view. They primarily see and use the creative economy's power to provide what they consider good employment and skills, specifically how as business owners they can offer internships, job training, and actual jobs to people in ways that are meant to mutually benefit both parties. So when, an example, a guy named Barry who works in the film industry, he co-owns a production company and manages a studio in Newburgh. When he first came there in 2017, he was sensitive to wanting to integrate into the community, not just bring the industry there, as he puts it. So he sets up a training program that shows youth a variety of roles in the filming and pre- and post-production processes. But he also admits, I quote, "Our mission was not just altruism. We also want to build a crew base in the region. So we have people nearby who we could hire for shoots," close quote. Similarly, a man named Walter owns a boutique press that makes high-end manuscripts and stationery, with a companion nonprofit institute devoted to the teaching of the arts and crafts of the written word. He owns scores of vintage printing presses, many of which have not been used by the larger industry in decades, and he uses a variety of rare bookmaking techniques. So the knowledge and skills required to run his business the way he wants have largely disappeared, and certainly did not exist in the Newburgh workforce when he moved there. As he puts it, "Before moving here, it was about following craftsmen literally to the ends of the earth. And in coming here, we have to be in the business of teaching and perpetuating it." And that's where the idea of the Institute came from, is that it's about teaching, it's about passing it on. And you can't hire somebody who's going to come in and be a letterpress printer. You have to teach it and build your own team. And it becomes then very much about community. It becomes about this notion of urban revitalization through craft in Newburgh. This is a model that makes sense, close quote. So to him and other creative workers in the city, teaching the underprivileged communities to work directly with materials is a winning strategy for both groups and for the city itself. Under a model of urban revitalization through craft, everyone benefits. The needs at stake and the efforts, however, very much originate from and revolve around the businesses and profit motives of these cultural producers rather than of the community itself. Most of the newcomers' initiatives are very small in scale, often the efforts of a single person, and involving a handful of participants. Cultural producers also focus on how they can help others with what they do rather than what others may need. And most use their businesses in ways that will eventually come back to help them financially. And without any mechanisms of evaluation on their efficacy, it's unclear what impacts, if any, these initiatives are having on the communities and lives of the people they aim to serve in terms of economic benefits or enrichment, to the extent that the latter could even be measured. This situation is different from cultural scenes in large cities where artists may merely be passing through. I skipped a slide because I'm going slow now and I'm not on my normal pace. Or not in an economic position to improve local conditions. Okay, yes. Final thoughts, here we go. So I want to return to the questions I started with, just to recap. What kind of productive citizen is the craftsperson, the artist, and the artisanal worker? What kind of citizenship is being enacted and promoted by these groups and businesses that regularly connect with their cities through logics of authenticity that privilege and promote the local and construct communities around consumption and production? And how do they engage politically and civically? And what impacts do these actions have on urban space? I'll start with this last question. So my research is showing that while craft workers are inherently optimistic about the impacts their work has on their industries and on the city around them, the urban context plays a key role in shaping the actual impacts they have on urban space as individual actors. Collectively, craft workers have a similar influence on space wherever they're found. They contribute to processes of gentrification and upscaling through elite forms of subcultural production and consumption. But their influence as individuals becomes enlarged in small cities where they find themselves acting as makers of culture, makers of materiality, and as makers of urban space. They confront the city not merely as creative workers, but as informed citizens and economic developers with a vision of place filtered through a craft and artistic lens. Second, what kind of citizenship is being enacted and promoted by these occupational groups and businesses? Though the kind being enacted is one based on a normative understanding of creative production, on the idea of the citizen as both a maker and a curator, a selector of taste. In the case of Newburgh, creative workers chose the city in part because of their interest in the aesthetics of a specific type of urbanity. They were selective in their decision. The same is true for the businesses that they have started and the ideas for the city they are promoting, highly curated. Given the upscale nature of the entrepreneurial Bohemia, or the fact that the producers behind this creative economy are advanced professionals with highly discerning tastes, a considerable economic, social, and cultural gap exists between newcomers and existing residents. The latter lack the financial foundation or backing, the networks, and the knowledge of value and taste that the former has used to construct a vibrant, dynamic, and expanding community and economy. Teaching skills through vocation education and on-the-job training, as many of these newcomers suggest, on its own would not necessarily bridge all of these gaps and include people from low-income communities into this economy equitably. Finally, what kind of productive citizen is the craftsperson, the artist, and the artisanal worker? Well, we often describe this figure as someone who lives a certain authentic subcultural lifestyle, one that is countercultural, in which creative interests, again, are more important than monetary pursuits. But these characterizations do not hold in these contexts. They don't live countercultural lifestyles, but conventional middle-class ones. They don't take creative approaches to business, but typical professional ones. They don't take alternative approaches to upward mobility, but promote supply-side economics. The productive citizen craftsperson is a business person with a creative bent, engaging in creative forms of sometimes charity, and a privileged non-expert in the realm of urban affairs, made more influential over shaping urban space by inhabiting what are essentially poor spaces. I'm going to stop there. Sorry for going too fast, and I hope to talk to you all later. Thank you very much.